good morning. A warm welcome from AIPPI's General Secretariat in Zurich. My name is Arno, and I'm the Executive Director of AIPPI. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second edition of the WIPO AIPPI Joint Webinar Series. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce a very distinguished guest today. It's WIPO's Director General, Mr. Francis Gurry. Francis Gurry has led WIPO as Director General since October 2008. He was reappointed for a second term in May 2014, and his term is about to run out in September 2020. In this capacity, he is also the Secretary General of WIPO, the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants. Francis is an Australian national. He holds a law degrees from University of Melbourne and a PhD from University of Cambridge. He's also an honorary professor of various universities and holds honorary doctorates from several universities across the globe. Under his leadership, WIPO has addressed major challenges such as the rapid technological change, obviously the phenomenon of globalization, as well as also several efforts to reduce the knowledge gap between developed and developing countries. Francis has also been instrumental in ensuring that the international IP system serves its fundamental purpose of encouraging creativity and innovation in all countries. In order to equip the organization with the tools to meet all these challenges, Francis has led a comprehensive program of internal organizational change in order to better align WIPO's activities and programs with the organization's strategic goals. As most of you know, Francis Gurry's current term will come to a close at the end of September. And on the 8th of March this year, the WIPO member states appointed by consensus Mr. Darren Tang as the organization's next Director General. Mr. Tang's six-year term will begin on the 1st of October 2020. The last months have been pretty turbulent, and all international organizations in Geneva have been strongly impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. So it's a great honor for us that Francis found the time to join us today. Francis, thank you very much for agreeing to this format. Before we start, however, please let me briefly outline today's schedule. The Director General will start with a short introductory speech, touching upon a few issues, such as the long-standing cooperation between WIPO and AIPPI, a short overview of WIPO's main activities and outputs in 2019 and 20, as well as a brief introduction into WIPO's newly released business tool, WIPO PROOF. We will then have a short moderated Q&A session with the DG. The session will be moderated by two AIPPI bureau members, Luiz Henrique do Amaral, AIPPI's first Vice President, and Tsoi from Hong Kong, AIPPI's first Deputy Secretary General. Furthermore, there is an opportunity for the audience to submit questions to the DG. Please use the Q&A button located in the middle of the bar at the bottom of your screen. I will explain this in a second. Finally, if you're interested in getting a practical insight into WIPO Proof, please stay on until the end of this session. The practice session introducing WIPO Proof, presented by Mr. Claudio Cocorocha from WIPO, will follow immediately after the conversation with the DG. WIPO Proof is a new online service tool that helps creators and innovators safeguard their valuable intellectual assets. So before we start with the speech, a few housekeeping rules. If you would like to submit questions to the DG, please use the Q&A button located at the middle of the bar at the bottom. You should be able to see this now on your screen. Please note that we cannot guarantee that we will be able to pick up your questions because there will be a lot of questions. We can only pick a few. Although the chat function is also open, please do not use it to ask questions. However, if you incur technical difficulties, we may be able to help you if you use the chat function to approach our colleagues. There will be a brief feedback survey at the end of this webinar. Thank you very much for providing us with your thoughts. So without further ado, I will now ask the DG to give his introductory speech. Francis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Arno. Well, colleagues, dear colleagues, first of all from AIPPI, but then from across the world, it's really a great pleasure to be with AI. It's always a pleasure to be with AIPPI. And let me recall just at the outset, our deep and long-standing relationship. It goes back to the 19th century, as you're all aware, and AIPPI has been really a constant and constructive supporter of international cooperation in intellectual property, and we are deeply grateful for that at WIPO. So thank you, Arno, and all colleagues who are here, and all of the membership of AIPPI. Well, look, if I may, I'll just I'll try to be brief, a little of the current situation at WIPO very, very quickly. A couple of reflections on COVID-19 and its impact. And of course, these are premature. We don't really know about this, but just some tentative reflections. And then something about WIPO and how it's evolved over the last 12 years in particular. And then finally, briefly, WIPO Proof, which Claudio Cocoriquia, my colleague, will address in greater detail, and a little on artificial intelligence. So it's a speed agenda, I apologize for that. But on the current situation, well, look, I think as we see it, I think the first thing that question that we ask is what's happening to demand for intellectual property across the world? And we don't have a clear answer to that yet, because in many respects, it's early days. We are now June, and we've had 2 full months, really, May and April, of the impact of the rather large global impact of COVID-19. So it is early. The classical view would be that we will see demand for trademarks fall immediately. And this is because trademarks are, of course, new products, new services, new enterprises. So that it has an immediate impact. We would see at the international level the impact on patents take place much more slowly, perhaps next year. And that's because you file internationally generally 12 months after you've filed nationally. But it's also because patenting is a long-term activity. It reflects, it's the end of a chain of actions that have research and development, product development that has taken place over a much longer period of time. This is bearing out to some we are seeing that. So the Madrid system for international trademark registrations, we see had a decline of roughly 16 or 17% in the months of April and May. So this is quite radical and quite immediate. The PCT is as yet holding up, and designs are holding up, but it's, of course, we're dealing with a much smaller number. Now, is there any change to the classical view that we will see in the current crisis with COVID-19? Well, I think since the last economic crisis in 2009, of course, the tendency for technology to be a dominant factor in society and the economy has only been accentuated. So that may be a slight difference. Now, of course, there has been geopolitical shift as well, and we've seen the rise of China. And very interestingly, I can tell you from our chief economist and the figures that they've received from CNIPA, the China National Intellectual Property Administration, that in the first 5 months of this year, international patent applications under the PCT from China have risen by 20%. Now that's quite extraordinary when you consider, the context that we find ourselves in. And filings for international trademark, also under the Madrid system, are very strong from China. So, scenario that we see, it's going to be a complex situation, but we need more time to work out, what is. As far as WIPO is concerned, we are fully functional. And that's a consequence of the digital transformation that we've undergone over the last 10 or so years, and all of our services are delivered electronically. However, there are 2 areas in which we are suffering. The first is meetings. Of course, meetings depend on people traveling and physical presence. So we have not been able to restart meetings, and there is a reluctance on the part of member states to undertake normative discussions in a virtual mode. We hope to at least be able to hold hybrid meetings, that is partly physical, for example, delegates in Geneva with physical distancing, and partly virtual by the month of September at the latest, assuming stability in the epidemiological situation. So that's one area. The other area that suffered is development cooperation and our technical assistance programs. Now, a number of those programs are delivered electronically. For example, our technology and innovation support centers, our iPads program for office automation, and so on. Nevertheless, we are feeling the impact there. And so they are the two areas, I think, where the crisis has had a real impact. Some reflections then on the crisis, quickly. Well, you know, I think it's a brave person who makes any reflections on the world in general at the moment, and on the impact of COVID-19. But the one thing that I would say is that I think we are seeing, to some extent, an acceleration or an intensification of certain pre-existing trends. They're not new trends, but they are accelerated or intensified. For example, geopolitical shift. That has been going on, of course, for 20 years or so, and we've seen the rise of Asia and the rise of China in general. But there is a slight acceleration in this, I think, in the current circumstances. Secondly, digitization, the whole digital transformation, with the move towards a greater amount of economic activity taking place digitally. Well, that again is intensified and accelerated by the COVID crisis. We are finding, of course, that by necessity, a lot more economic activity has to take place digitally. That's not new, it was already happening, but it's accelerated and intensified. I think we're seeing a slight tendency to a reversal of globalization and towards localization, in particular of manufacturing. Now, again, you could argue that that was happening or starting to happen. First, because of certain political flavors around the world that have been in favor of localization or the repatriation of, for example, manufacturing, but also because for technological reasons. Advanced manufacturing techniques and artificial intelligence, for example, are enabling Adidas to manufacture fully, without labor, in Munich, running shoes that they may have used cheaper labor, cost labor in Vietnam or Indonesia to manufacture in the past. That was happening. Again, it is accelerated in the current crisis, I think, to some extent. And then I think we're also seeing an acceleration of the, it's very difficult to find a word to describe it, I would say the reshuffling of the international architecture and multilateralism. And that, of course, has a direct impact on the World Intellectual Property Organization as a multilateral institution. So all of those things, I think, are happening. Now, we don't know exactly where we're going to come out on all of this, but I think we should be conscious of it. And I'll spell out one or two implications in one moment. Now, if I may briefly then move from that, the general reflection on COVID-19 and its impact to looking at WIPO and some of the things that we've been able to do in the course of the last 12 years. Very briefly, of course, we've reshaped and revitalized the campus. We built a new administrative building for 500 people. We have built a new conference center for 900 people. And we've not only built those and they're fully functional and they're generally extremely well received, but we've fully paid for them as well. In terms of financial management, we are fortunately in a very good position to weather the crisis that is coming for the organization, because the organization depends for 94% of its revenue on the services it renders. And as demand falls, we will receive an adverse impact. But we have positioned ourselves in terms of reserves, I think, extremely well. I think we've seen a great buy-in across the world to intellectual property. That one indicator of that is accessions to our treaties. So they've been at record levels for the last 2 years, for example, well over 20 accessions to treaties from countries around the world in the last 2 years. That's a very positive thing because I think it shows that the world as a whole is embracing intellectual property and understanding the importance of intellectual property in the contemporary economy to a much greater extent. So that's an extremely positive development. I must say that we have great buy-in from right across the world. I mentioned geopolitical shift. Well, obviously, that's been a major factor because now we see that around about 2/3 of all intellectual property applications filed worldwide are filed in Asian IP offices. And this is complete transformation. And we all know it and we all talk about it all the time, but I think, you know, we can't talk about it enough because it's the shape of the world to come. And it's the same with our services. In the PCT, over 50% of the applications, international patent applications, are being filed from Asia. And of course, you have China, Japan, Korea as major economic and technological powerhouses, but you have a lot of other countries as well. And so I think this is something that's to some extent obvious, but it does not mean, in my view, that Europe is declining or the United States is declining. We're talking about a decline in share here, not a decline in absolute numbers. What I think it does mean is that there are new players. Competition is intensifying, whereas competition took place between, let's say, in the technological area, Europe and North America, for a long period of the 20th century. What we're seeing now is, of course, that it's a much more multipolar scene for innovation and for IP, and that's here to stay. And I think the competition for intellectual property will become, and in the field of intellectual property and in technology will become more and more intense. And we see that with China and the United States and the tensions between them, which largely revolve around technology, you know, but it's not just China and the United States. There are many, many signs of this. Just about every, you know, country in the world, well, many countries in the world are revising their foreign investment regulations. They're looking at much more stricter relationship between security and economic investment. These are the consequences of the geopolitical shift that we are starting to see play out and will see play out more and more. Digital transformation I've mentioned, and of course that's been a huge thing for WIPO. And we have been able to weather the COVID-19 crisis reasonably well because of our IT platforms and the delivery of services through electronic platforms. Now we have, as you know, as users of our systems, we have a long way to go. This is a journey. The PCT electronic environment is rather complete. The electronic environment for Madrid needs much more work. The electronic environment for The Hague is complete internally, but we have to externalize it. So there's a long shift that we have to go. And then lastly, let me say that in terms of general multilateralism, it's a very strange situation. Lastly, on the developments over the last 12 years, that is, it's a very strange situation. We are seeing, I think, the traditional architecture of multilateralism, that is, the United Nations and its organizations, sidelined. I mean, to put it bluntly. And since there's very little time for anyone to kick me out now, I can be a little bit more blunt than usual. But we are seeing that. I mean, this is just an observation. It's not a criticism. It's not anything else. We're seeing that. And I think we should take that very seriously. And I think it means that we have to go through a process of rethinking what international cooperation is all about and what are the forms of international cooperation. Now, the UN form of international cooperation was invented 70 years ago in an entirely different world. The circumstances have completely changed. So this is a long subject. I can't say too much about it. It's it requires a lengthy and in-depth discussion. But let me say that one manifestation of it for WIPO, two comments on WIPO really. One manifestation of it is that we are doing a lot more cooperation through platforms than through treaties. So for the first 100 years or so of WIPO's existence, the traditional instrument of international cooperation was a treaty. So if you wanted once to introduce a new service like WIPO Proof, when you would do a treaty which would say that we would establish, the organization will establish WIPO Proof. Now you can bypass that with the establishment of with the approval of the member states, with the establishment of an electronic platform. And it's up and running. And as Claudio will tell you in a moment, he will have the latest figures, but we've had buy-in from about 30 countries. I think it's 38 countries. He'll tell you exactly what it is. Users in a very short period of time, 3 weeks. And they're not necessarily the traditional users. So many users from Brazil, many users from Mexico, and so on. So this is a very interesting phenomenon. The forms of international cooperation are changing, and it's bringing the private sector closer to us. And this is where AIPPI is so important, because you are such a conduit for telling us what is happening on the front line, which is where you are involved on a daily basis. Now, two final comments, I'll stop. Artificial intelligence. Well, this is a long discussion as well. We have started, because of the difficulty in the normative area, by calling this a conversation. We want to put out of mind what the end result is. In many respects, the result is a process. And it's the process of the world coming together to be able to define what are the questions for intellectual property that artificial intelligence is raised. And we have our second conversation coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and we have over 1,100 persons registered to participate in that conversation from right across the board, over 67 states for a start, but many, many corporations and research institutions and digital institutes. So this is, I think, a great result. And it's indicating that, you know, we are able to function as a world and as a society and have a conversation virtually where we are not able to do so physically. So perhaps I've spoken too long, Arno, I apologize, but I leave my remarks at that point. I'm very happy to go into any of the details.
Thank you very much, Francis. We're now going to move to the moderator Q&A session. So Luiz, Henrique, may I ask you to start?
Francis, thank you very much for being with us here, for all the support that you personally has given and honored AIPPI with. It's been a very long and close relationship that we hope we've developed with WIPO, and that will continue, that you personally helped to build, and we hope to continue to help with WIPO. The question I have, and I'm going to turn a little bit more specific into your administration. As your term is coming up, it's a moment normally to reflect on the achievements that you've been able to implement within WIPO, and the achievements that you hope that will continue to be developed that you started. So my question is exactly, what are the main achievements that you believe that have been built during your 12-year terms, and what you expect to be moving forward, the initiatives that you started and that hopefully WIPO will continue?
Well, thank you very much, Luiz, Henrique. Thank you. Well, the first is that we have some fantastic staff at WIPO. We have some really true professionals, really great staff, and I think that's apparent in many of the services. WIPO Proof was put up with the help of our colleagues, one of them, Claudio. In a very short period of time, we're able to be fully functional. That's an example. But, you know, our AI applications are in various areas. Our digital platforms, these are all, you know, the result of very talented and committed professionals. So overall, I'd say, look, the positives may be, I hope, greater buy-in, very sound and stable financial situation, which is extremely important. You know, we have reserves beyond what our target was, and that is going to take us through this terrible economic crisis and enable us to function fully without any impairment to our services. I think also responding to the geopolitical shift. I mean, this is very important. We have to pay attention to things like the fact that, you know, what does 50%, over 50% of international patent applications coming from Asia mean? Well, what it means is that over 50% of the world's latest technology is in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Now, if you're operating in Brazil or in Europe or wherever, that's a new situation. If you're a startup hoping to go global, then you'll want to know what rights might be able to be opposed to you when you go into other markets. And you're not going to be able to do that these days unless you have some form of access to the languages in which a lot of the new technology is being written. And so our AI-based neural network translation application, it becomes extremely important. The service we give of providing an English abstract and a French abstract for every international patent application is extremely important. So I think we have to think through, what does this mean? It also means, as we've discussed, tension. Now, I'm very happy that for the most part, WIPO has remained a little island in the middle of an ocean of dissension. So there's a big storm going on in the ocean, and that's how I think it should be. We should try to be the place that reflects what is agreed. Now, it may be that only 7% of, you know, the space is agreed, but this is the place where we have agreed and where we agree to cooperate. A lot goes on out there. It's beyond, you know, we have no powers in relation to it, nothing to say, really, and that's the way the member states want it. But we have to try to slowly make that 7%, 8%, 9%, 10% to enable business to function around the world. And I think that's the task. So that's a question of, you know, it's really the ball's in the court of the member states. You know, are they going to cooperate? Now, fortunately, despite all of the turmoil in the different political approaches being adopted around the world towards international cooperation, and there are many, you know, and I wouldn't single out one in particular because it's not true that it's happening in one or two countries only. It's happening in all countries. All countries are rethinking their attitude to international cooperation at the moment. Now, in that, I think one of the things that struck me is that WIPO has been around since, you know, 1883. And actually, if you look at the international organizations, the International Telecommunications Union, the World Meteorological Organization, WIPO, Universal Postal Union, have all been around since the 19th century. And during that period, the League of Nations was born and died. the United Nations was born. You know, it's a testimony to the sustainability of international technical cooperation. So where you get professionals, as you know from AIPPI, people come from, I don't know how many countries you have, 130 or so members in, and they're coming together because you're professionals, you've got a common language, and you can talk, and you can create the basis for, I think, peaceful coexistence in the world. This, I think, is not to be underestimated. So I think, you know, maintaining the technical focus of WIPO is terribly important amid all of the quite excessive political rhetoric that we're hearing these days.
If I may, a very quick follow-up question on the
Sure.
specific issues. We see, at least in a country like mine in Brazil, that there is still a little resistance to embrace intellectual property as a tool for innovation. And this is not only particular to Brazil. In many countries, we still have this certain hesitation to embrace IP. And specifically in our case, we've had with the agricultural business in Brazil has changed exactly because of biotechnology that's supported by patents and that should be viewed as a positive sign. So going into the WIPO role, do you think that this is also part of the WIPO initiatives to help the countries understand the importance of embracing IP?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Luiz, Henrique. I think we could talk for hours on it. It's a great question, and I think it's you know, it's a key question. It's really a fundamental question. I think that unfortunately, in many international discussions, there is a tendency for them to be fact-free. You know, so people argue from preordained ideological positions. And they don't necessarily look at the facts. Unfortunately, this is reality. You know, this is the world in which we live. It's not just internationally that this happens, of course, as we all know. So that's where I think maintaining a technical focus is extremely important. Now, my personal view, and it's not necessarily the institutional view or the member states' view, is that the whole purpose in life of intellectual property is to find a balance between competing interests. Now, that for me is clear if you just take patents. Patents, we're saying, okay, society would like technology to be disclosed. And people don't have to do that. They can keep it secret. And society says, no, we want you to disclose it. And if you disclose it, we'll give you exclusive rights for commercial exploitation for 20 years. After that, it falls into the public domain. Well, that's the basic contract that we all know from, you know, learning IP at the beginning. That's a balance. It's a balance between the interests of society, the interests of innovators, and the interests of consumers. And I think that goes on right across the intellectual property system. If you go to the copyright system, you get the same sets of balances. You know, you get the exclusive rights for a period, but there are exceptions, there are limitations, there are, you know, so that's what it's all about, finding a balance. Now, that for me means that the old views that IP is all bad or IP is all good are completely misplaced. Because it's neither all good nor all bad. It depends on the balance as to whether it's good or bad. And that's the task of all of us professionals, whether we're working, you know, defending interests here or there, promoting enterprises, helping establishing innovative enterprises, or we're playing the regulatory role, whatever it is, we're all involved, I think, in the same game of trying to find a balance which serves the interests of society, enables innovation to go forward, but not excessively. So that's, for me, is the great beauty of intellectual property. It's a great mechanism for, you know, joining in this discussion engaging in this discussion of what's right and what's wrong.
So I think it's my turn now, Francis. Thank you again for joining us today. So it's a very interesting presentation you just mentioned, and you talked about how the COVID-19 has actually intensified and accelerated some of these pre-existing trends. And the WIPO is rethinking the way international should cooperate in the area of IP. So I think for your successor and your colleagues remaining at WIPO, what do you think their challenges looking ahead will be? And are there any other new topics that they should be looking into?
Yeah, well, thank you, Annie. Nice to see you. And it's not, look, it's not for me to say what my successor or my colleagues, you know, who will continue should be doing. You know, I'm finishing. So, but looking at the broader world, you know, I think this, and we all know it, but it's sometimes useful to, you know, dwell on it. This whole digitization process, which has been accelerated by COVID-19, this is very profound, and it's changing the landscape now in many, many ways, including for intellectual property. That's part of the process that we're trying to engage in with artificial intelligence. It's part of the process we're engaging in with WIPO Proof. So Claudio will speak about this, but what we're doing with WIPO Proof is just adding a small service, only a small service, not a, you know, revolutionary, you know, all-encompassing. It's a start in the area of data. So if you like, the classical intellectual property system was very much built on industrial technology, you know, and it was very much built on the notion that there is such a thing as an invention, and there is such a thing as a design, and there is such a thing as a creative work. And these are now categories of data. The data that correspond to, well, being non-obvious, providing a leap of that being new and being industrially applicable and so on. What we're seeing, I think, is a huge amount of new activity with respect to data. Only we're at a fairly premature stage, because the fact is that it's not easy to find value in data. We know there is value in data there, and you know, so in laboratories, biomedical laboratories, they have enormous amounts of data, and they are of potential value. But the value is as yet unrealized. You know, they may become an invention, they may become a trade secret, but it's a huge amount of data. Now we see that all over the world. There's a huge amount of value in data. The internet giants are using data to sell you things. They're using data to track things. They're using data in a multiplicity of ways. We don't understand all of this yet. We know that lots is going on, that a lot of value is being created. A lot of enterprises are becoming extremely rich in the process. Now, what are the right sets of balances to get between society, consumers, producers, and users of data? Now, that question, nobody's got the answer to. It's a huge question out there. And that, I think, is something that's going to preoccupy all of us in the coming years as we start to work out rights and obligations and balances in relation to data. And you can hear it politically. You can hear people saying, that's not right. Facebook shouldn't do this. You know, Cambridge Analytica shouldn't do that, and so on. But we have to construct the framework built upon right balances for all of that. And fundamental to it all is property. Whose data is it? You know, and so I think we've all got lots of work to do there.
Right. So you've mentioned, you know, like this, when a lot of people talking about the Industrial Revolution 4.0, and then it seems that this term is becoming obsolete already because we're quickly moving, you know, like leaping a big step forward. So while there have been some arguments saying that the the so-called innovation ecosystem, international IP systems are already very complex. Now, with all these new areas, the data, AI, big data, that we don't know very much about. So what would be your comments about how we can then continue to cooperate internationally? And how can organizations like WIPO redress such perceptions that these international corporations are far too complex, too difficult for us?
It's a great question. It's a fantastic question, because I think complexity is one of our problems. Complexity has happened, and we've built complexity with interconnection, amongst other things. So it's not possible to tackle any crisis. COVID is a less good example, but if you think of who's trying to tackle COVID-19, well, everyone in the world. So there are certain international organizations, there are national governments, there are people, there are hospitals, there are clinics, there are research and development institutions. Everyone is involved, because it's a complex problem that involves so many different dimensions: the health, the epidemiological dimension, the economic fallout dimension. How do you balance one against the other? So I think complexity, you're right. We are seeing it, excuse me, very much in the field of intellectual property, because we see the new technologies coming on. Now, can the architecture that we invented for a less complex world or a non-complex world solve the problems of a complex world? I think no. I think no. But what's the other architecture? What is the new architecture? That's what we're all living and seeing. We're seeing a lot of tensions about, and those tensions are happening, of course, internationally, but of course nationally too. People are in the street, and they're in the street for many, many reasons. Excuse me, for many, many reasons. But it's also related to complexity. Everything is interconnected. So I think this is a real question. And can we continue to chip away at solving elements of complexity? And I think that's what we have to do for the moment, short of having new architecture. Right. But it's a great look. It's a long discussion, I think. I don't have the answer.
It's a very Zen saying of using less complexity to solve complexity. So I think we do need to have like more younger professionals to come and help us to solve these puzzles. Now, again, you mentioned just now that because of the COVID-19, that there are certain impact on WIPO work. Meetings are suffering, so you are having like a hybrid meeting, physical and virtual, and also developmental and cooperation work. So these, perhaps maybe more like a short-term impact immediately we're seeing the next couple of months. So would there be any longer-term impacts that you foresee brought by the COVID-19?
Yes, I think for the operations of this organization, they're definitely going to be permanently influenced by the experience we've just been through with confinement or lockdown. For example, we will embrace remote working amongst our staff in a way that we did not previously, because as a matter of fact, it works. Now, but to make it really work, you have to change your management practices also. You have to managers have to communicate more. They have to be more in touch with people. You have to have very clear results framework. So it's an effect which will have implications right across the board. That's just for the working of the Secretariat. Now for the member states. Well, member states are still succeeding in doing certain things and in moving forward certain agendas. We have to see how that is impacted too. I don't think we'll go back to the world where frankly the architecture was designed 70 years ago, as I said. It was, we convened a committee, the committee deliberated, everyone went home, they consulted nationally, with their interested parties, And then they came back 6 months later and tried to advance it a little further. That's all telescoped now into a simultaneous. You don't have to go back to consult your your interested parties. They're in the room, or if they're not in the room, they're online. So I think we have to look at the architecture here and change the model and have a model which is more inclusive. This is a good thing we're trying to do in the AI conversation, for example, is that it is for member states, it is for interested parties, it's for professional organizations, it's for research and development laboratories, because complexity demands that we get all of those players at the table, because the knowledge is spread right across all of them. And it's not happening in the old way of, well, a government is there and it goes and consults, interested parties. There are parties that are way ahead of the government in their understanding now. So this is, I think complexity is causing us to, review architecture. I don't know what the answers are, but we have to keep thinking about it.
Thank you so much, Francis.
So we are now moving to questions from the audience. And again, you can ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom bar of your screen. The first question that we received refers to, Francis, to your most recent contribution to the debate on IP and access to medical technologies. And that is in the context of health emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic. How would you respond to those who look at IP as a major barrier to access in health emergencies, for instance, in the current pandemic?
Well, thanks, Arno, and thanks to the questioner. Look, as I said a little earlier, there's a great tendency to have fact-free discussions internationally and nationally. Now, I think the first thing we have to do is to look at the situation as it is. We should not look at the situation by saying, well, we had a debate in the 1990s about access, and we had positions that solidified there, and we're going to come straight in with those same positions. We have to look at the facts. And the facts tell us, in my view, at the moment, and of course it changes very rapidly, they tell us at the moment that IP is not a barrier to access. Because as a matter of fact, our problem is that we don't have anything to have access to. So surely that should be the primary policy focus. What we need is a vaccination, and we need some therapeutic. We need some treatments that are effective and approved. And we don't have those yet. Now there are, over 1,000, I think, clinical trials going on around the world for vaccinations and therapeutics. There is some promising news that came out yesterday from the United Kingdom in relation to the use of a steroid in critically ill patients, producing some sort of result. I think we need to focus on innovation first and foremost. That is happening. Of course, that's happening. But when you go to innovation, well, the innovation ecosystem is a very complex ecosystem. 70% of research and development is funded and performed by the private sector, and 30% by the public sector. So you need all of those players involved, in my view. And then, look, when we get to the happy situation where we have a vaccination, or we have a vaccine, or we have a therapeutic, well, the IP system has a series of measures in it, built in nationally and internationally, to ensure affordable access. And I have no doubt that governments will start to implement those. So I think it's a question of sequencing, first of all, that we should be having an argument about something that doesn't exist at this stage. We should be focusing on innovation. Let's cure the problem. Let's get the innovation that's going to, help us all move forward. And then we'll work out, and the provisions are there, in the treaties and they're in the national laws. And if they're not there sufficiently, well, let's have a discussion and fix it so that we can actually get on top of this problem. So for me, people have gone off in some instances half-cocked, as they say. You know, the gun's gone off before it's been fired in the aim has been taken. It's been and the shot is accurate. We need to focus on innovation. The IP system, I'm sure, is robust enough to provide access in this, what is so clearly an emergency, an international emergency.
Thank you very much. The next question refers to an organization in Geneva that also deals with IP. And over the last few months, we have seen actually the WTO being derailed and being kind of impacted by some of the member countries. What is your take on this with regard to WIPO? So is this good news for the other organization? Is this of general concern? What is the impact on WIPO, and what is the impact on the IP system in general?
So look, I think it's part of the, first of all, part of the multilateral reshuffle that I mentioned earlier. You know, lots are happening in this space, and you know, clearly some of the major players in the world are taking a different look and a different tack on international cooperation. We have to, as an organization, in my view, be there when, you know, the new cards are dealt. We have to be there. And now we've got a good record on that, thanks to all of the support we get from organizations like AIPPI, because we've been there through 2 world wars and a great, you know, the Great Depression and various other transformations, absolutely extraordinary transformations in the world. And professionals around the world have still come together and found an extraordinarily consistent vein of saying, okay, authors, composers, we need to reward you and ensure that you have the possibility of a decent economic existence. Innovation and innovators, we need to find the right economic incentives to have the right sort of investment in innovation. Nothing says that the system is perfect, but there is a system there and there are a way of doing it. Now, WTO and IP, well, since the TRIPS agreement, which after all is nearly 30 years ago, they have had, of course, the paragraph 7 innovation, which was extremely important in relation to access, actually, and compulsory licensing, but not much else. So I think what happens is that states, you know, the states are self-interest maximizers. They look to advance their position on the international stage, which is competitive, and that's appropriate, and that's not a criticism, that's just how they behave. Many of the industrialized countries saw in the late 1980s and early 1990s an advantage in going to WTO to try to develop new norms for intellectual property because they had more power there, frankly. That has changed. You know, it's switched around. And so we've seen a lot of countries favoring doing business in WIPO. This, I think, is a constant battle. This is going to be there. And it's not the secretariats that can sort this out. I think it's member states who act as, you know, rational, we hope, self-interest maximizers, and they choose the forum where they think they can advance. I think that our record is not bad. You know, it can always be better, but we've done the Marrakesh Treaty, the Beijing Treaty, we've done the Singapore Treaty, we've, you know, in this period of time since the TRIPS agreement, the WIPO copyright treaties, you know, quite a lot has happened to just slowly advance the international normative framework. And now in the area of platforms, well, I don't think WTO has any. I mean, in our area, we're the ones who have the TISCs and the IPAs and the digital access service and this, that, the other, and the global databases and so on. So I think that I see IP being probably inevitably part of any grand bargain that comes out of WTO in the future, but the prospects of a grand bargain at the moment are extremely limited. So it's over to WIPO to continue chipping away and advancing.
Thank you very much. Another question is from a UK member. So you spoke of the increase in PCT filings from Asia. Is there some data, or do you have some trends on whether startups and SMEs are increasingly using these services as well, in particular the PCT?
We don't have, I don't have that on the top of my head. It's a great question, and I think it's a very extremely pertinent, if I may say, extremely pertinent question. I'm sure my colleague Carsten Fink, our chief economist, and his colleagues in the statistics area will work on this, because that's extremely important to know who's using from the newer users. Yeah, I'm afraid I can't give the answer off the top of my head. Yeah.
Then we have another question from a South American member. Is it possible to make to mark as public domain the very old PCT patents in patent scope, like 30 years old or older?
Yeah.
So to better identify them and to provide reliable online information to access free technologies?
Yeah. Now, look, I think, you know, we are doing some work, and there's been a project in the Committee on Development and Intellectual Property on this, of trying to work out what's in the public domain. Of course, anyone can do this. And there are some great examples. You know, one example that was brought up by an American outfit, brought up was the roller skate. You know, the roller skate, well, now the roller skate's perhaps a bit out of fashion, but the roller skate was patented in 1948, and everything is there in the drawings. This is how you make a roller skate, and this is what the roller skate's about. Now, that fell into the public domain at the latest, around about the mid-60s. The roller skate craze came in about the 1980s. That was all in the public domain. Anyone could have said, hey, let's build a roller skate. Now, perhaps I'm not giving an illustration of the most socially useful technology, but this happens right across the board. And it's a real mine, a gold mine, the databases. People can do the work themselves very easily. You know, it's not too hard, and there are the tools to do it on our patent scope database to find out, you know, what is available. I mean, we are pushing forward to try to identify it also as well, but it's all there, I think.
We have another question with regard to AIPPI's work. As you know, in AIPPI's main products are its resolutions on specific IP topics. Some people may say this is an outdated process, or is something that is very traditional, or it looks a bit like a model UN process of deliberating and debating. Where do you see the value of this input from an international organization perspective?
Look, I think it's of immense value, you know, because as you say, it's got many of the hallmarks of multilateral, you know, cooperation. So you are getting different parts of the world coming together, professionals from different parts of the world coming together and saying, first of all, this is a problem, you know, we identify a problem. And secondly, here, you know, here's possible solution. That's great input, I think, fantastic input, because it's coming from professionals who are involved on the front line. And it's not being dreamt up by people. Now, it is a slow process, and it's going to the same sort of, you know, architectural tensions that, you know, international organizations suffer with our traditional meeting schedule and sequencing. So I think, you know, it's not for me to say, but we are seeing slowly the notion of working parties working virtually starting to become operational. So examples would be in our very technical committees, like our classification committees, you know, the NIS classification and the IPC, or our standards committees. Now there, a lot of the work is actually done between meetings by particular working groups. And the working group will form of people from all different parts of the world, and they'll advance with a solution and then come to the committee for the committee to give its approval to the solution. So I think you are doing that with your questions, and people are working around the world. And I think we will see that happen more and more. But yeah, we do have a problem with time, you know, and speed. The fact is that technology is out there and it's having its impact before any of us who might be considered policymakers, whether it's AIPPI or WIPO or national governments, are able to appreciate what is going on.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll pick a final question, and that also refers to something that we're very active. Patent law harmonization discussions, I mean, have been going on for many years, and some progress has been made, but we still don't see, like, you know, a system that where when you file in one country, it automatically applies anywhere else, or it speeds up the process of patenting somewhere else. What is your take on this? Will this ever be achieved? Are we still steering in that direction? Are there any major obstacles on that way?
Yeah, look, a great question also, and it is a point of great frustration. We've been through a period, you know, in which, because of the TRIPS agreement and because a number of developing countries felt that, you know, they were made to swallow the TRIPS agreement when they were not in a position to appreciate what it was all about. Now, whether that's correct or a correct perception or not is really beside the point. That's how they felt. And it led to a situation in which, for the latter part of the 1990s, many of the early 2000s, harmonization became the H word. You know, you were not allowed to say it, the H word. And, well, look, that's just ridiculous in my view. Sorry to be so brutal and frank. It's just ridiculous because it depends on what you harmonize. Now, if you're going to harmonize standards for the interconnection of mobile telephones, you can't tell me that's not a good thing. Everyone wants their mobile telephone to work when they get off the airplane, if there is an airplane, you know, in another jurisdiction. And that can only happen through standardization and harmonization. So it depends on what you harmonize and how you harmonize. The exercise at WIPO to create an international instrument for traditional knowledge, for the protection of traditional knowledge or traditional cultural expressions, is a harmonization exercise. That's what it is, you know. So this view that came out was very understandable that that view was there because people, you know, were taken a bit by surprise by the TRIPS agreement. So it's understandable, but being understandable doesn't mean it's right. And I think it is regrettable that there is this gut reaction against harmonization. And it's also, you know, it's based on the view that harmonization means adopting the highest possible standard. It doesn't necessarily. It means adopting the most effective interoperable standard for a globalized world. So I think we need to get out of this. Now, the other comment I would have on it is it goes to, you know, this crisis of multilateralism. Because the current system in a multilateral system is a consensus-based system. And in this world, which is, you know, suffering from at least temporary insanity, I would say, you know, you can't get consensus across 192 states in the world. So what are we going to do about that? Are we going to stop the bill and say no international cooperation? It's a real crisis. It's something that we need to think about. I would say that the tendency is for people to fragment and to balkanize. And I would say that's something we need to be a little bit careful about, because you will have regionalization and or like-mindedness. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing at all, except if it becomes so rigid that we end up with blocks again and the world dividing. So it's a very fundamental and crucial point here. I think that to some extent, what we need to be able to do, at least this would be my small contribution or attempted contribution, is we need to be able to find a way to advance plurilateralism within multilateralism. So that's the original architecture of WIPO. If you look at the Paris Convention and you look at the Berne Convention, there is an article in each which says member states are free to conclude agreements amongst themselves, provided that those special agreements are not inconsistent with the mother convention, Paris or Berne. And for many years we had that. You know, PCT has 153 member states, Madrid has 117, 19 or something like this, so countries covered. The Hague has, 64, something like this. All differential. It's a menu. You can choose. I'll have that, I'll have that, I'll have that. And that allows plurilateral cooperation. At the same time, they were concluded under in a multilateral organization. So the multilateral organization said, okay, you can go forward with your thing. It doesn't interest us, but please go ahead and do it. That has stopped, unfortunately. And it stopped more or less at the time, I would suggest, of the TRIPS agreement. Because the TRIPS agreement introduced a fundamental change in the architecture internationally. It was no longer a choice, a menu du jour. It was no longer a la carte. You can choose PCT and choose the IPC and this. It became menu du jour. You're getting sausages and frites, and that's it. And there's no choice. It was to join the international trading system, you have to have all of that. So it was a fundamental change in the architecture. Now, I think we have to go back, frankly, and allow individual groups of member states to go forward with things that interest them within the multilateral umbrella. Then you can say, so what's so hard about that? Well, what's hard at the moment is that some countries are saying, well, sorry, it doesn't interest us. We don't want you to do it either. And I think we have to develop a reason or a rule as to when people can block something. If we're based on consensus, and I think you should only be able to block something if it affects your interests. And if it doesn't affect your interests, you shouldn't be able to block it. So let me give you an example. We had a lot of controversy about this over geographical indications in the Lisbon Agreement. And with the United States and a number of other countries saying, no, we don't want you to do that. Now, I don't want to take their argument, their point in the side in the argument at all. I think this is over, fortunately, but it did affect their interests. Why? Because if you protect geographical indications internationally, that has an impact on those countries' export markets. There's a legitimate reason, I'd say. As I said, I'm not in favor or against of any side in this, except that I can say that geographical indications and the Lisbon Agreement are an integral part of WIPO, and they will stay that way, And then the argument, that was another question. But there are other instances in which you might be objecting to some countries doing amongst themselves something that has no impact on your interests. I don't think you should be able to stand in their way in those circumstances. So that's the sort of discussion we have to have going forward. You know, what does consensus mean in a world in which you can't achieve it? And how can we overcome that to advance international cooperation? And I would say allowing groups of countries to express their interests and to have agreements within an overall multilateral framework should be the way forward.
Thank you very much. I mean, we touched upon many great questions that provide food for thought for many hours of discussion. In the interest of time, we have to come to a close. On behalf of AIPPI, I would like to thank you, Francis, for agreeing to participate in this webinar and also for answering the questions of our members. If this were an auditorium, this would now be the perfect moment to physically hand over a token of appreciation. It's a bit difficult in today's webinar context. We send off a present. It got apparently stuck in the Swiss postmail, together with all the online shopping, I assume. Nevertheless, I mean, we would like to hand you over a quick present. Hopefully it arrives while your term is still running. And on behalf of the AIPPI Bureau, I would like to thank you also for the excellent cooperation over the last 12 years. We would be delighted to invite you as a guest of honor to the next AIPPI World Congress in Hangzhou. It takes place a year later due to the current pandemic situation. And thank you very much for agreeing to this format. And again, thanks a lot.
Well, thanks to you, Arno. And look, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege. I'd say the one thing about, the greatest thing about having been able to serve as Director General of WIPO has been the exposure it gives you to people. It's really wonderful. And that I've deeply appreciated, and it's really, really been wonderful. So AIPPI has been a big part of that, and for a long time, beyond my term as Director General. So thank you, Arno, and thanks to all colleagues.
Thank you very much, and stay safe.